Welcome everyone to the Common Good Project's conversation series on what is the common good. My name is Ryan Mead and I am the convener for this series, and I'm joined today by my co-convener, Chris Conway. Today we have a guest who I'm particularly excited to have, and is a colleague of mine at Blackfriars. So we are going to have a conversation with Edward Hadas, and we will, as usual, begin with the introductions by Chris, and then Edward will have some opening remarks, and we will have a conversation. I would like to thank, as always, the Faculty of Law, Blackfriars Hall, and the Aquinas Institute for hosting the event. I would also remind listeners and students especially that we are exploring what is the common good in the context of law and society. And we've been using Thomas Aquinas' definition of law as an ordinance of reason for the common good, promulgated by the one who has care for the community. And that the directedness for the common good in Aquinas applies to more than just law, but civil society generally. So with that, Chris, would you please introduce our guest scholar today?
Today, our guest scholar is Edward Hadas, who is a research fellow of Blackfriars Hall, focusing on economics, finance, and philosophy. Edward is an accomplished journalist, working for many years as economics editor and columnist at Reuters Breaking Views. He also spent a year as assistant editor of the Lex column at the Financial Times. Prior to his work as an academic and journalist, Edward worked for 25 years as a financial analyst in Boston, Paris, and London for many firms, including Morgan Stanley and Putnam Investments. In his academic life, Edward has taught political and social philosophy at Maryvale Institute in Birmingham, and has given a wide range of lectures at Oxford on economics and moral theory. He is also a tutor in philosophy for Stanford University in its Stanford in Oxford program. He has published 2 books. The first is called Human Goods, Economic Evils, A Moral Approach to the Dismal Science in 2007. And his second book was called Counsels of Imperfection, Thinking Through Catholic Social Teaching in 2020. He introduced a theory of money in an article, 3 Rival Versions of Monetary Inquiry, Symbol, Treasure, Token, recently published in the journal New Blackfriars. That theory is part of a mostly completed book, tentatively titled Money, Finance, Reality, Morality. Edward received a BA in Mathematics and History from Columbia University, and a second BA from Wadham College, Oxford, where he read classics and philosophy, and subsequently took an MA. He also was awarded an MBA in finance from SUNY Binghamton. And with that, we will welcome Edward.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Edward, for joining us. We will start with the hardest question first. It's the one we ask everyone. What is the common good?
Okay, I'm going to take the liberty of answering that question by reading a quote from the book that Chris just mentioned, the second book of on Catholic social teaching. And I'm going to say that this is that I am being here unapologetically Catholic, in the sense that I think, as you just mentioned, Ryan, the common good is a notion that's very closely connected with the Catholic philosophical tradition. And so I have no reason to apologize even to secularists, atheists, and so forth for bringing this in from a Catholic perspective. But it's also a non-apologetic introduction, in the sense I'm not trying to convert you to, and it's not a defense of Catholicism, it's just a helpful intellectual tradition, I think, in this thing. But I'm just going to quote myself now, if I may. The common good encompasses the transcendental and creaturely flourishing of individuals, of various social groupings, of entire societies, and of all humanity, past, present, and future. In society, the common good is both created and enjoyed communally with each member and each organization, both responsible to contribute appropriately and able to benefit abundantly. reflects that each person, it reflects the truth that each person's flourishing relies on the flourishing of all. And it reflects the sometimes painful corollary of that truth, that this shared flourishing sometimes requires that some members of the community give up on elements of what might appear to be their individual good. The common good that enhances, supports, and sometimes seems to sacrifice each individual's good. This good is at the heart of the Christian vision of society. So that is the common good. A long and rather laborious description, which I've actually shortened from what's in the book, but I think that's the way that I would like to think about the common good.
And Edward, I think that it's a good starting point in our discussion. First off, I should say the book is particularly excellent, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I rank it as one of my favorite books that was published in 2020, albeit late 2020. One point, though, is that as you read that, it seems that the common good, which we'll explore, has many different manifestations of a definition or an attempted definition over the years, that it's not proposing a utilitarian approach where there's simply an aggregate of this and that, where it's all added up. But it seems as though what you described is closer to that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, for sure. And again, if you know, Thomas is very clear that the social good, the communal good, is more important than the individual good. But I think one can go even farther than that and say that the idea of an individual good that's abstracted from some communal good is itself a confusion. I mean, the idea of the sort of utilitarian, individualistic notion that I have my good, which I can define in some way without thinking about the good of those people who love me, or those people who take care of me, or those people I care for, is itself confused. All of our goods, even the ones that we might think of as most individual, are in some way common. And so the common good, the unified common good is merely a way of trying to think about a very large community that we're all part of. I think of Elizabeth Anscombe, who talks about the utilitarian calculus of morality, and she invented the word consequentialism. And she says the problem with it is that it's just stupid. It doesn't really make any sense. It's not in any integrity towards the way humans actually work or the way that we think of that. And so the sort of the intersection of individualism and common good thinking is going to be a very unhappy one, because it's just not, the individualism itself is a very faulty way of thinking about things.
Do you think it's even possible to concretely define the common good? We seem to be able to identify what it isn't, as we've just discussed, but perhaps do you think it's best to leave it vague, the term the common good vague, and have it more as a beacon orienting us rather than something super precise?
Yeah, very strongly, I feel that. And within the Catholic tradition, which is, as I say, not necessarily relevant to the legal tradition here, there have been various attempts to define it, and I think they're all unsatisfactory. I think ultimately, it's the common good is itself a primitive concept. And you know, if you think about some of the questions of in terms of philosophy and definitions, you always need some primitive concepts, some concepts so we more or less understand it. We may chip away at the edges of it through negative definitions, as you were just saying. It's not this, it's not that. But I think this is a very good example in social thinking and thus in social philosophy and in moral philosophy and in law, which is a communal effort, of something that probably there are no terms with which you can define it that are going to be more basic than the term itself, common good.
I think, Edward, that's very much in keeping with, as we're talking to our guest scholars throughout this series, that people are chipping away at the edges of it, defining what it's not. We opened with the conversation on the antonyms of the common good. But let's go a little bit deeper and say there was an attempt to try and harden the common good into specific prescriptions. And does this hardening of a definition, does that risk becoming an ideology? Or in other words, can it get too clearly defined so that it becomes a tool of authoritarian?
Well, authoritarian governments like notions that are both vague and have the possibility of themselves filling in what they stand for. So the will of the people was very big in the UK a few years ago, which in the Brexit debate, and a lot of people felt, I certainly felt, that it was being used in a way to define who the people were in a very narrow sense, sort of excluding a lot of people from being the people, and to identify their will was taken as a sort of governmental task. And that is a very authoritarian way of understanding that phrase. The common good isn't a phrase that I hear as often in terms of governments talking about it. I think we've talked about this, you and I, Ryan. It's a phrase that seems to have kind of lost a lot of currency in the political sphere, at least. Perhaps because we are such individualists in many ways in the way that we want to talk about things. But it's a very easy phrase to say, well, this is for the common good. And in that sense, an authoritarian government can use it and fill in the blanks with, I'm not sure it would be a definition, but a kind of applied usefulness of it. And what Chris said earlier is it's better as a beacon, as something that's always a little bit beyond us. And is this contributing, is policy X or arrangement at Y contributing towards building towards the common good, rather than saying the common good consists of, all children going to school or all children being vaccinated for COVID or whatever. We want to make it a more open-ended concept, I think.
And I think that we had someone recently comment that what we are attempting in this conversation series is constructing a common good framework. And I think that's a very good phrase, because along the lines of what you just said, is that it might not be something that we can specifically define, and it possibly could be too dangerous to define, because it can be used in so many ways. It's lost a lot of currency, as you note. I think it is coming back a bit, and
I hope that this series helps its rebirth and fertilizes its. It's a great concept. It's a key concept in Catholic social teaching correctly, and I think it deserves to be revived and fortified for the contemporary age. Yeah.
Right, and it is it's also something where I think that under the right circumstances, it's also graspable simply as humans, that the common good is something we should be directed to. Chris, thank you.
Sure. I have another question, Edward. Your remarks bring up a theme many of our guests have grappled with, and that is how to express individual goods and social goods, and what the distinctions are between those two. Do you think that these terms set up a false dichotomy?
Yeah, as I said in the beginning, I think the idea of individual goods is itself a faulty idea, and the idea that we have this contest between my good and our good, it's one that Thomas rejects quite explicitly. And I mean, obviously, Thomas is only if farther you get away from the Dominican house of study, the less authority Thomas tends to have as a master. But there's something very true in this particular statement, that it's impossible to say that this is my good, but it's not good for the community. if it's not good for the community, it can't truly be good for me. Now, obviously, because we live from a Catholic perspective, we talk about we sin. So, we are sinful in various ways, and this creates all sorts of problems. One of them is that the common good is often served by things that are, from an individual point of view, if we could try to abstract ourselves, they don't seem very good. I mentioned that in my definition. The obvious examples, soldiers who serve the common good by dying, by being killed for their country. And from a narrow individual perspective, we say that doesn't look like a very good deal. But we can understand that they are the better, as it were, for it, because they've offered themselves for a greater cause than even their own life. I mean, leaving aside the rightness of war and particular wars and so forth, the basic logic of sacrifice is one that is built into our nature, is our response to the weaknesses and disorders of the world. And so I think the attempts to say that there's a fight between the individual good and the social good is a very pernicious, it's a morally pernicious and socially pernicious way of thinking about things. What you want to do is explain to people that you are not possibly serving your true individual good if it's really against the common good.
I think that also brings back to the point about our past, is you described the weaknesses that people might have, and that human flourishing as an end of the common good, or a goal of the common good, can happen now and in the future, but we can't do anything about our flourishing or lack of it in the past. Yet you put the past into your non-definition, you referenced it a bit. And so what are you trying to get at there?
Okay, let's call it a description, not a non-definition of the concept that I gave.
Related?
But okay, so I think one of the things you have to think about here is the idea of authority and tradition, which are two ideas that go together. That we come into the world and we receive a world in which there are authorities. In the family, there we have the government, that we have our parents, and in the state we have our government, and in civil society we have various sorts of authorities that guide us. And what they do with that authority, if it's a legitimate authority, not based merely on fear and violence, is they bring and develop a tradition which they pass on to us, traditio, to hand on. And so it becomes ours. And the common good is going to inevitably include the passing on of that tradition, the recognition of the past. But because we're humans, we're free, we respond each freely, and each generation responds freely. The past becomes ours by making it the present, by changing it, by adapting it to our own needs and desires. But the idea of a kind of radical break with the past is, I think, almost always, and there may be moments of the past being so corrupt that we need to really break with it. But for the most part, in most civilizations and most families and most states, the common good is always served by taking some part of the past, purifying it, and developing it. So, I mean, to give an example, if the Nazis, whose idea of the common good is one I hope we would all reject, wanted to be the Third Reich. So they wanted to take on some of the past of what they considered Germany, or what they considered the German past. And after the Nazis fell, their tradition was one that was rejected very firmly. But there were other German traditions that the new government wanted to take up very strongly, for good reasons, because without a tradition, your authority becomes very, very dubious, and your concept of the common good becomes one which is what you mentioned earlier is very easy to turn into an authoritarian one because you have no framework from the past to guide you. So no legitimate authority, and you will end up depending entirely on violence for your notion of the good. And the good and violence really are very difficult to reconcile.
And as we've been discussing, that trying to define the common good too precisely is futile and may even be dangerous, as you just mentioned. It seems that we cannot agree even on its merits without an acceptance that humans have a nature and an acceptance about some basic things about that nature and how it flourishes. Do you think that's right? And do you think that such an acceptance is even possible?
I don't think we ever really don't think that humans have a nature. I mean, this is a pretty high-level philosophical argument. The last few hundred years, the nominalists have had the upper hand in philosophy, and that you want to say that humans don't have a nature that is useful for this. But I think that is much like, well, I wouldn't say it's stupid in the way that utilitarian calculus is stupid, but I would say, well, that I would say it is, Elizabeth Anscombe says it is, but I would say that it's incoherent to try and think we can have a system of law or of civil order without some sense of what humans are like. We can argue about elements of that nature, and that's where your pluralism comes in. But we can also find a consensus that say humans wish for the good, they wish for the good of the next generation. It's very relevant in social thinking or legal thinking, that you're oriented towards the future. You can say, these days we think about our nature as people placed in the physical environment, and we have a responsibility towards that as that part of our nature. We have a nature that is morally weak and yet morally ambitious. I think we can find ways of talking about human nature that are coherent, helpful, and we can get at least some social consensus on, so that we can use that to try and work on the common good. But your first question is can we talk about the common good without some sense of human nature? No, you can't. You do need some idea of what humans are like, what they're aspiring to. In fact, the first comment I made was one of the basic comments about human nature, is that we're social. We come to be in a societal way, or to use Aristotle's word, we're political. We come into the world, into a community. That's our nature. And one of the rather odd turns of modern political philosophy, starting with Hobbes and Locke, is to deny that we are actually social primarily. So we have an argument there about human nature, but well, one side's wrong and one side's right, and of course my side is right. I think we need to decide in some way about human nature, and indeed, as far as Locke and Hobbes go, they may make that claim about individualism, but in practice they accept that we always do live in a society, so our nature is social, even if it's a sort of post-Lapsarian nature in their case.
And this seems to be somewhat of a paradox of contemporary culture, wanting a free roaming liberty and maximal autonomy, but still asking to be treated equally without value judgments or anything like that. If autonomy is the starting point rather than shared human nature, then it seems that there is no basis for me to treat you as another self. If you can't be another self to me, then why should I even try to understand you?
Yeah, autonomy is one of those big concepts, and I always think of Kant thinking that autonomy was basically the opposite of what Catholics stood for. Heteronomy and autonomy, other people give me laws, bad, says Kant. Autonomy, good. says Kant. I give myself laws. And by the time you get to the Second Vatican Council, and I mean Kant's example of what was heteronomy is the Catholic Church. But by the time you get to the Second Vatican Council, the Second Church the church statement in Gaudium et Spes is that we respect the legitimate autonomy, and I love legitimate here. Legitimate has is another one of those words that's going to be pretty difficult to define in a way that we will agree on. But again, I think we might have a notion is that there is a level of autonomy that we have in our nature that we need to, as I just said about tradition, we need to understand and make our own. We sometimes talk about conscience as a sort of sign of our autonomy. But freedom without truth, freedom without some respect for our actual human nature, for our weaknesses, our moral weaknesses, our intellectual weaknesses, freedom without that kind of truth is very destructive. And as you just pointed out, Chris, without any kind of sense of the other person as also having freedom, also having his legitimate autonomy, and also having an obligation, as I do, to respect the truth, there's no relationship. It's something that we, in practice, actually take for granted, that we can sit here and show respect for each other, or we can sit here, that we can use language with each other already shows that we're sharing a nature, that we can have a common shared set of meanings, and we can decide among ourselves whether we're showing full respect. As I mentioned before the session started, I feel very disrespectful because I'm not wearing an academic gown. I'm not even wearing a tie. And I'm breaking the rules of this session. And I should feel uneasy about this because this is part of the way that I demonstrate my respect for the autonomy, not individual in this case, but of this group, by wearing the clothing that's considered appropriate. And so I'm violating I'm here to praise the common good, and here I am by my very clothing undermining the common good of this group. But see, this works around to your question, which is, I couldn't even make this argument, and you couldn't even excuse me from it, as I know you will, if we didn't have a shared notion of what the good that we're trying to demonstrate by our autonomy would be. And we do have that notion. It's implicit in the way that we share our language and we share our values with each other. And so we can talk about the common good in a meaningful way.
I think, Edward, first off, I don't have the authority to excuse you, but I think I think that you are excused on this point, but it also is, although it's a very light point, it also demonstrates what you mentioned about coming to the discussion and dialogue. It may very well manifest, the common good may manifest itself in communities in different ways to promote human flourishing, but we have to have a shared nature in order to talk to each other, as you say, to even have a common language. Your point about that many thinkers, despite their rejection of nature and of a human nature, are nevertheless still referencing a human nature. It's very hard to not see them referencing a human nature, even when they deny them. Reminds me a little bit of, I believe it's Gilson had a quip about idealists, that idealists are idealists until they're hungry. And so in this discussion of anything, it strikes me about law, unless there is a utopian, let's make this anew, which even that I assume assumes an implied human nature, that the notion of a human nature is absolutely fundamental and a common human nature for us to have any discussion and dialogue. And last week, we spoke with Erica Bakiaki about how human nature provides the basis for both men and women to have the capacity for virtue. But it seems a shared human nature proposes something even more. In that conversation, we were talking about Mary Wollstonecraft's view of a common nature. But I'd perhaps go a bit further, that this radical ontological equality in our human nature is equal for genders, races, and classes. And assuming that you agree with that metaphysical point, how does that translate into the common good, the equality of our human nature?
Okay, equality is one of those phrases that it's a word that is always borrowed in any kind of philosophical language. You know, we use it in mathematics in a very clear sense. So we say the phrase, the formula on the left is equal to the formula on the right, and we have a very good understanding of what that means, what that you can use the two interchangeably in a whole set of mathematical or every possible mathematical formula. When you say people are equal, it always has to be in respect to something. And the only way in which we're equal that I can understand, well, that's not quite true. I can understand us being equal in terms of, in the eyes of God, we're all equally human. We can also be equal in front of the law. But even there, if you start to think about it, we're equal in front of the law in some rather theoretical sense. But for example, children are treated differently in the law because they are seen to be different from adults. So I'm never quite persuaded that equality is a social concept that we can run into, embrace with the same sort of enthusiasm that one can run into and embrace the idea of a shared human nature. Because in practice, in our lives, we are not equal in many ways in society. So it is inevitable that some people will have more things than others, that some people at some part of their lives will have more authority than others. For example, I mentioned children. I think children are very important philosophically and have not typically received the attention they deserve. We will be ill and we will be less equal in terms of our physical capacity. We are ill. We are not equal in our intelligence, if that's a coherent concept. In some ways, it certainly is. And certainly Thomas Aquinas felt that a good society was one that had a very strong social hierarchy, that leaders were different in important social ways from the led. And one can debate just how vertical the hierarchy should be. One can make a very good case that we've flattened that hierarchy by universal literacy and much, universal basic services of various sorts. And that's a good thing. I basically cohere, but I don't think that thinking of equality past the level of we should all have this infinite human dignity as loved and created by God for God, which is a religious way of saying it, but you can give it sort of Kantian, we are ends and not means, which in some ways comes to something rather similar. But that sense will be true, but the social implications of that claim are by no means obvious. And this isn't the forum for arguing about the differences between men and women, but actually philosophically, it's a huge leap from saying men and women are equal in the eyes of God to saying women should have equal employment opportunities or equal this and that. I'm not saying that I disagree with it. I'm just saying that the one doesn't imply the other with the same sort of obviousness that it's often presented. You have to make a different kind of argument for why it is unfair or unjust for women to be treated differently from men, because you must say they're equal in their professional capacity or in their social capacity. But you must think about the equality that you're dealing with there, and you must say, well, the differences between the sexes are genuine, but that doesn't affect this kind of part of our social life. It's a different argument. So I would leave equality, other than this equality of dignity. I wouldn't get started on that as a basic sort of tool for thinking about the common good. That's an unpopular view, but I would defend it.
Well, I like the phrase equality of dignity, and I resist launching into a lecture on the French Revolution distorting the word equality in our language. But we'll move from theory. We'll just say enough theory, and let's move into some practical questions about the common good.
All right, I have a practical question. So in practice, in the real world, who is going to identify the common good and the means to human flourishing? Does this require the state surveying society to set this from a top-down approach, or is it bottom-up? What do you think about that?
I think that's a really hard question, and I don't think there's an obvious answer. I mean, I would think the one thing, I'm going to give you a negative answer, is that we have a vision these days that I think of as a Hegelian vision, because it's sort of the end of Hegel's history, where the state and the spirit of history merge. And in that vision, which the closest we get is the People's Republic of China, I mean, in terms of countries today, where the state identifies itself with the common good, particularly the Communist Party identifies itself with the common good. And it does exactly what you said. It then patrols people to see how closely they are following that vision that the state has declared. And Hegel says at the end of history, our freedom will be perfect because our own decisions will be exactly those of the spirit of history as expressed through the state. So we become most free when we decide the same thing as everyone else, which is what the state decides. It's a vision of freedom that's sort of the opposite of the liberal vision of freedom, but it's one that is really quite potent in our society and not one that I'm in favor of. I think the common good is much more something that we debate. If you wanted a philosopher, I would go for Habermas and sort of communicative discourse, that we talk about it, that we have it in our debates on whatever policies we're making in whatever domain we are. So I used to work as a journalist in this very small organization. I mean, Reuters was quite large, but my little bit of it was very small. And there were maybe 30 people who worked there, of whom 10 were basically decision makers. And the 10 of us that were decision makers would talk about what the common good of this organization was, and then we'd bring in the other 20 people, and then we'd talk about it. And so there was a kind of procession of making this decision, and there was a boss who ultimately would decide, but under the influence of and subject to the corrections of the rest of us. And I think that's very typical of the common good at a small scale. In the government, that's where we have governments. We have kings, have advisors, and noblemen that they both, boss around and are responsible to. Democracies have legislators. Even dictators have some kind of some kinds of checks on their power, we hope. But dictatorship isn't my model for the common good. So it's sort of the way you phrase the question, it rather suggests that if we're really serious about the common good, we need a really, really strong authoritarian government to find it for us. But no, it's something that we have and that we understand implicitly as humans. And so we can debate how it can be worked out in this particular circumstance. And we can use, God forbid, philosophers and people like the ones that are speaking at these colloquia to help us to think about what kind of things serve the common good. And you just, the last question was about men and women, or was partly about that. How should we try and organize the relations of the sexes so that both sexes flourish? And think about how that hasn't been done in the past. And so there's a tradition we wish to change and evolve. That's the kind of thing that we can do as a group rather than from the top down.
You mentioned Hegel, and earlier you mentioned Locke. So I want to bring those together because I've often heard you use this phrase many times. We talk Locke, but we act Hegel today. So what do you bring the two together, and what do you mean by that?
Okay, so I once gave a talk with exactly that title, and I was so excited about this title because I think it's such a great piece of philosophical sloganeering. And I thought the auditorium would be overflowing with people thrilled to think about this topic. And I'm afraid very few people came, and it was all rather baffling to the ones who were there. But what I mean is, I think is something quite important is that, and this was a question that was raised in earlier about the pluralistic society, is we love to talk about ourselves as having a pluralistic society, many different values, and everyone gets to make up his own mind. I have this autonomy, and I don't need, because it's a pluralistic society, I don't need to have a uniform standard. We have a public square where everything is allowed, or most things are allowed. And this is the Lockean vision of a social contract, at least one reading of that vision. And that's how we talk Locke, particularly in political philosophy. John Rawls, it's the 50th anniversary of A Theory of Justice. And there were encomia for this, the book that came out for the anniversary, and it's talking about how political philosophy is all about Rawls for the last 50 years. But in practice, governments have been getting more and more Hegelian for a century, 2 centuries. I mean, really, if you think of it Hegel's way, since the first tribe was replaced by a king, they've become more Hegelian. But certainly this idea of a larger bureaucratic administrative state that takes farther and farther into the lives of its governed. They take care of your education. They ration out your health care. Even in the US, where it's private, technically it's all very heavily regulated. They regulate everything. And ideologically, you can see in the giant fights over, say, critical race theory, that we expect the government to set the tone. And we can still fight about what tone they should set. But the idea that we're actually in a Lockean pluralistic society is a nice piece of rhetoric, but bears very, very little relation to the actual organization of society. And so the question that Chris just asked about the common good, about authoritarian vision, yeah, that's the way that we're heading, is that we will have, I could go on about this, that we will have a state-defined common good, but I could go on about COVID, where we have remarkable intrusion of the state into restrictions of movement and wearing masks and all sorts of things, and leaving aside for a minute the scientific rationale for all that, the notion that the state has intervened in our very private, what used to be our very private freedom, free areas where we would make our own choices, and said, no, you can't do this and you can't do that, in ways that is really almost never done before, and very much influenced by the experience of the People's Republic of China, suggests to me that, yeah, the states and the people who are governed feel very comfortable with the Hegelian vision of the state telling us what our good is, our common good. And they just, we decorate the Hegelian cake with a little bit of Lockean icing, but we're basically, what we're eating, what we're nourished by is this vision of the state defining the common good.
Hopefully you are delighting a bit in today's slight easing of the restrictions in the UK.
I am now allowed to hug people, which if when the government has given me permission to hug people, I think that the state has really taken on a lot of, in some places in Canada, the health commissioner was telling us how we should have sex, because that's for the common good. We have to do this or not do that. I think the state has become rather intrusive. That's not a Lockean state that does that.
Well, and let's hope June 21st gets here with the roadmap. But along those lines, despite the horrors of the Hegelian state that you just described, that it seems as you see many states headed to, would you agree that some sort of state is natural to human society?
You mean that we have a government?
Yes. Some
Oh,
sort.
absolutely. Yeah. You know, it's not like the opposite of Hegelian state is libertarian anarchy. This gets back to the notion of authority. We need to have a legitimate authority. We need to have authority that comes with some kind of tradition, some kind of respect, some kind of divine sanction. And any kind of positivist approach where you just say, okay, this is what we're going to do without any logic based on who we are, what our nature is, what the traditions that we're trying to continue are, what the problems we're trying to solve are based on some notion of the good. As soon as you give up on all that kind of stuff, you're in an arbitrary land where the state then becomes totalitarian or authoritarian at least. And Hegel didn't mean to be horrible because he thought that the spirit would in fact lead to people's freedom and to their flourishing. What he didn't understand historically is that we're not good enough for that, and we need to have a government to restrain us, but we also need to be able to restrain the government. The government has to be under law itself, and under the law that is an authoritative law that's higher than any government, to have a hope to be free or to be to flourish in the deepest human sense.
With our remaining time, I'd like to turn to economics. You've argued in your writing that economic activity is human activity, specifically the actions of a body of particular humans. Those human activities must be grounded in a morality that has an end or a purpose. This seems to be one of your main critiques of many ways of thinking about economics and finance today, that goods move, transactions occur, but economic analysis assumes that there is no purpose other than just the transaction. It leaves the ultimate purpose of the transaction to the parties. If I understand your critique correctly, what if this type of economic analysis is accidentally correct? That many transactions do not have any real purpose other than the accumulation of things or of excessive consumption?
Yeah, I think, I mean, they may have a purpose, not a very good purpose. You may say, well, this is a transaction that's based on a faulty understanding of the good. And the faulty understanding will be at the level of myself thinking of my place in the world. So it's individual, if you will, but it's really a social decision. I think I need to consume this much because that's who I am in this community. So I'm going to buy, another car, say. I only have 3, but a 4th car would help me. And then there's a social choice there. Why are we trying to sell people 4 cars? Why are we trying to make that many cars? That seems somehow wrong. But it's not that we don't have a purpose. It's that we haven't really thought about the good well enough, and either from the perspective of the person who is buying the car, or from the perspective of the common good understood correctly. Which, I mean, as I said, those two can't actually be in contest. But however you approach it, a lot of the economic decisions we make in terms of organizing the economy are decisions that have not been morally well thought out. We're just not vetted, if you will, morally by any kind of very helpful standard. And I mean, I will say, and I know you have a couple more questions you want to ask, but just to go on a second, is that the actual economy is a lot better than the economy is described by most economists. So if economists get very defensive about this, and they say, that's just economics 101. This is what we tell the ignorant. We're sort of Gnostics. And so most people that come into this, all they take is one economics course, and all they hear about is how people work in competitive markets where they are self-interested and vicious with each other, and the more they have, the better. And that's what economics is about. And if you accuse them of being sort of horrible human beings who think of themselves as just greedy accumulation machines, they say, no, that's not really what we mean. We understand that people actually cooperate and that they have many goals and all of that, but we don't tell them that in the first year economics class. That's only for the initiates once you get to graduate school. And I have a whole complaint about that. Both, I don't think they're honest, and if they were honest, why would you tell lies to the first year students if that's really what you don't think? If you really think they're lies, why do you tell people lies? But I could go on about that. But what I want to go on is actually, if you look at the economy, one of the things that the giant administrative state does is it regulates it based on virtue. I mean, it's based on some common good understanding. We have welfare systems, we have tax systems, so we tax the rich more than the poor. We argue about how much more we should tax the rich than the poor. But the basic principle of progressive taxation is one that's very widely accepted. And because we believe in equity in the economy, we believe that services should be universal. It was a great sort of battle in the 1930s in the United States that there should be universal electric coverage. It was not fair that people who lived in isolated places should have to use kerosene. That's not based on economics, or certainly not in the economic thinking that is taught in Economics 101. It's based on justice, and it's based on a sense of the world that should be fair. We have consumer standards. You buy a pint of milk, and it comes with a giant description of what is in the milk because it's required. And you know that milk has been, as a certain temperature of storage and so forth, because the law protects you. You would probably buy the milk and pay less for it at lower safety standards, but the law protects us. And that's part of the economy too. So I think economists give the economy a bad name, would be the way I would put it.
I would also say, Edward, that many professions probably give their own profession that name for what you've touched on, and that is that it's a bit of a mirage that law, for example, is neutral, or that it is necessarily a neutral arbiter, that it has some goal behind it, that civil society is not thinking about morality, or as is implied in Chris's question, that economic activity or transactions, that they can't accidentally not have a purpose, because we all want the good. We choose what we think is the good. It might be an apparent good. It might not be true. We had a guest in Hillary, Tom Pink, who described how the theory of the state is enforcing an ethics, even when the rulers will deny that they are trying to enforce a certain morality or an ethics. So I think this also comes back to that point that you mentioned earlier about nature, is we can deny it, we can try to talk as if there isn't one, but there's one, just as with there's always purpose in our actions. But Chris.
Yeah, speaking of mirages, most people believe that the law needs to recognize the fiction of a corporate body for certain practical efficiencies. But the structure of the corporation changed significantly since its early days in Roman law, and even in the form in the Middle Ages, which today's corporation resembles. A big change has been the allowance of corporations to operate for any legal purpose, rather than the narrow purpose that is charter defined. It is not a controversial statement, I think, to say that this has allowed many corporations to amass capital on a scale that would shock governments of only a few decades ago, but seems to shock very few people today. Just using market cap compared to GDP, dozens of corporations are richer than a majority of the world's countries. Apple, for example, is richer than Russia. Amazon is richer than Australia, and Tesla, which to my knowledge has never actually made a profit off of selling cars, is richer than any African country. What are your thoughts on the question of unstructured corporate purposes and the bloat that has occurred in these entities?
Okay, I have to be an economist here and say that richer than is a because this is market cap is a measure of stock and GDP is a measure of flow. So you're comparing things that aren't really comparable, but the basic idea is true. But I just, my conscience would accuse me if I let you just say that without some kind of correction. You wouldn't want me to go home tonight with a bad conscience. But the basic principle is very important. You mentioned the charter, but the whole modern corporation really develops in roughly the third quarter of the 19th century. As you say, from this longstanding legal form, and it's a disaster in a lot of ways. I mean, it's you wouldn't have, if you were starting now and thinking, how would I organize these entities? Look at these entities. I mean, Tesla's actually a tiny company. It's just market cap is nonsense. But say a company like Walmart, it employs, I think, 2 million people. So it has as many people working for it as a smallish country. It's what it sells is what is bought in particularly in the United States, where it's a dominant retailer. It has this huge authority in terms of commerce. And its labor practices become de facto the standard labor practices in a lot of communities because they're such a large employer and their negotiating power is so strong. The idea that this whole company would be governed by a group of financial investors who once put some money in. I mean, Walmart hasn't needed financial capital for years. It's self-generating funds. Well, I remember they were still raising money in the 1980s, but they stopped doing that a long time ago. That the shareholders, one group of financial investors, should in some sense be responsible for this doesn't make any sense. It's just, you wouldn't think that. It's way too important an entity to be run by on the grounds of finance. And you mentioned one of the problems, which is it doesn't even have a limited purpose. So it can decide to go into some other kind of retail, or it can decide to upstream integrate and make its own things. And this is a kind of lack of discipline, social discipline, that seems out of line. And you wouldn't, if you were starting from scratch, as it were, trying to take the tradition now, I think a reasonable case can be made that you wouldn't want it to look this way. And of course, because I'm all in favor of tradition, I'm also all in favor of renovation. And the tradition that's gotten really rotten, if you will, it's lost its bearings, as I think corporate governance really has. It's time for a pretty substantial rethinking of how you would want, what the maximum size is, how it should be governed in terms of how it should balance the various interests, how it should relate to the political government. Those are pretty legitimate questions. And I don't know what the right answers are. I think we need a dialogue or a debate on this. But I do know that saying shareholders own the company and the company is completely unbounded in its business range and its size, that's not a good answer.
And this is exactly why we like to have non-lawyers on this series to dialogue over language. So I appreciate you keeping me honest on those terms that I was using. We recognize that we're at the top of the hour, but we've cleared with Edward to go over a couple more minutes, but we understand if people need to jump off, but we'll keep trucking here. Much of the popular discussion of economics is built around the unemployment rate and the publicly traded stock market indices, specifically the day-to-day fluctuations of an aggregate trading price of the shares of a very small set of companies, such as the FTSE 100 in London, which is an index of 100 companies out of the nearly 2,500, or the Dow Jones in New York, which is an index of only 30 companies out of nearly 6,000. Are these indices any barometer of economic life? And as long as we are asking about stock trading and the common good, do you have any views on dual class shares which are being traded on these exchanges, in which some shares, let's say Class A, come with both ownership and voting control rights, and other classes of shares, let's say Class B, have no voting rights or such a reduced voting right that the aggregate votes of Class B owners could never counterbalance the aggregate votes of smaller and more closely held Class A owners. Any thoughts on that?
Okay, there are three questions there. How do we measure the economy? Unemployment rate's not a terrible measure, although there are a lot of technical issues with it. But it is one of the things that we do want to think about, is whether people are doing the kind of labor that they should be doing, and paid labor is socially significant. I like unemployment. It's, one, as I say, one can go on with problems with the way we measure it and thinking about unpaid labor and so forth, but that's a good measure. The stock market's a terrible measure. It measures money supply and optimism and profitability, none of which really have much to do with the actual economic good. So we should really stop thinking about stock markets in a basic way. Within stock markets, they tend to perform very similarly. So when I was in business school, people kept tutting about how the Dow Jones was a terrible index as compared to the S&P 500, but their correlation over time is extremely close. And this has to do with the way that companies basically perform in the same way in the economy. But we're now into a fairly technical issue about the way that stock markets work. And since I just said we should pay less attention to stock markets as an economic indicator, I would be now hypocritical if I go into detail on that. In terms of voting rights, well, I think this is part of that large dialogue that I was talking about before. How do we structure businesses in ways that are socially responsible, particularly businesses as they get quite large and have important impacts on society? I'm not as opposed to dual structure, within the current system. When I was working at Breaking Views, I was the minority guy who didn't really mind dual voting structures. I think often insiders do a better job of understanding what a company is than outsiders. And frequently, they're actually more socially conscious than outside investors who have a very distant sense of what a company does. When I started in this business, there were still local companies. There were quite a number of them. My first job, I didn't mention it in that biography, was in Buffalo, New York. And we had companies that were based in Buffalo, and their managers controlled them. And I would say in terms of social responsibility, the insiders had a much better sense of, much more concern for the community than most outsiders would have had. So I've always felt that one shouldn't just, the idea of sort of shareholder democracy is not one that I find very compelling, because I think these companies need much more complex governance thoughts than merely equity investors should run them.
And you mentioned how the stock market is a good indice for the economy writ large. Why do you think there's so much emphasis on the stock market? Is that just lead capture?
I don't know. When I was very young, I'm now old, and we used to have network news was a big thing, and the economy wasn't a sort of that important in the way that the news was reported. But the one piece of information they would tell you was what the Dow had done yesterday. So at the end of the Huntley-Brinkley report, for those of us who are over 200 years old or something, it was sort of, and the Dow Jones industrial average was up 23 points yesterday. I can't imagine that anyone really understood this, but what it could possibly mean. But I think this is mostly convention, because people wanted to have a number or a thing. And once you start to be an investor, and middle-class people, and particularly in America, used to be, and typically still are, although now much less directly, investors in the stock market, it was something that meant something to them financially. But it's just, it's just a bad business in so many ways that one should just, we have to go into sociology and so forth to figure out why it's become so important. But it shouldn't be. there are many things that are wrong there, but just it's wrong.
I have a couple questions to close up with. In Western countries over the past year, the printing press to support fiat money has been whirling. Do you think deficit spending hurts states and the common good?
Actually, no, not in itself. I mean, this is a complicated question because you're getting into some economic theory, but basically, the point of money and the book that you mentioned at the beginning that's now sort of finished and waiting to be polished. I go into this in some detail, but the point of money is to maximize the utilization or to make best use, not maximize, but make best use of the economic resources in a country. And if you don't have enough money to do that for whatever reason, because people are hoarding money or because production has increased, then make more money to balance these things out so that the right amount of money is circulating. There's a lot of problems with the way that the additional money was distributed in the last few years. So if you distribute it through the financial markets as they did, it largely goes to rich people. And there's social issues with that in terms of, we talked about equality before, and sort of to make the rich richer through government policy. I think a lot of people, if they understood what was happening, would feel uneasy with that. But there has also been, I just got a check for $2,400 from the US government for myself and my wife, which was rather random because I live in England, but I pay US taxes. But so that's a universal benefit from this money printing. But deficits themselves are not very indicative. What you're really thinking about is how much money is running around the economy. And but as I say, there's another discussion. But Stephanie Kelton, who just wrote The Deficit Myth, that's a pretty good book, although it could be more radical. But basically, deficits, no, they don't really matter in themselves. We'll see. This is a real test of the theory that we don't have any inflation because we've put a lot of money into the system, and so if money is ultimately inflationary, then we're trying it out. But there's still a live debate about just exactly what creates inflation, and inflation is economically unhelpful because that means there's more money than we need, than is optimal and is for the economic good.
Yeah, it does seem to me that there has been a little bit of a shift in at least some corners of policymakers where deficits and the need to balance budgets doesn't seem to be, the highest priority as it once was, and the deficit spending, at least in the United States, as we've seen recently, it's been embraced by both sides of the aisle. But the question then turns to what do you value with your what are you spending when you are spending money and running these deficits up?
Yeah, and I mean, there's a long history of this. In the 1940s, Abba Lerner, who was a University of Chicago economist, developed what he called functional finance, and he said deficits were the wrong way of looking at it. It was about balancing the economy with the money supply, and I think that's right. And he was right then, and we're right now. But there was an orthodoxy in another direction for many years that held the opposite. That governments shouldn't run big deficits, and I think that was basically just a mistake. I mean, there's an important issue here about if you borrow money as a government from your taxpayers, there's something fictitious about that transaction because you can take it away in the same way that you borrow it. So someone gives you money as to buy a bond, or he gives you money in paying taxes. There's an equivalence there, and we have to think about that more carefully to try and think through how to run the money supply. You'll be amazed to hear that I have a chapter about this in my yet to be published book. It's a big and complicated question, but it's an important one. And a lot of the thinking about it has been very muddled over the years. And so I hope to clarify it in that work.
I'll ask one last final big question. It seems to me that all these isms of economic theory do not actually help with the common good. Terms like capitalism and socialism, they've taken on societal meanings that I don't think particularly adhere to their actually true economic original theses. Do you feel that the terms capitalism, socialism are outmoded terms today that confuse more than they explain?
I feel that really strongly, and for those who are listening, these questions were not written by me, but that was a question that if I had been asked to write a question for me, I would be so happy to finish with that. If you look at the economy, just stop thinking in terms of these ideologies of capitalism and socialism. What do you see? You see, and this is true in every single country with the possible exception of North Korea, but it's true in the People's Republic of China, it's true in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it's true in Iran, it's true in the United States, it's true in Sweden. You see the same economic model. It involves large, intrusive governments with large social welfare programs and extensive regulation of the economy. It involves large private firms and small private firms, all of which are heavily regulated and which interact with each other and with the economy and with the government in various ways. The government acts both politically and administratively. So we can argue about whether how political administrative states are, but in every country, we have both political dictates from legislatures or governments and administrative dictates from regulatory agencies that are ultimately under government control. We have a certain amount of self-regulation where industries work together. We have a university system that supports this. And this is true everywhere. Now tell me whether that's capitalist or socialist. You can't, because it's capitalist, it's socialist, and that's the system we have. And to argue that we are a capitalist economy, or we are a socialist economy, or we should be a capitalist economy, or we should be a socialist economy, it doesn't make any sense. We can say we can have more government or less government, or this kind of government or that kind of government, or larger companies, or you were just suggesting some companies are too large. Or we can say we should have more not-for-profit companies, or we should have more entities like universities doing things that aren't exactly companies at all. We can have lots of arguments, good arguments, policy arguments, practical arguments, theoretical arguments too. But to argue about capitalism as if it was a system that was coherent and existed anywhere at any time in the world, especially now, or to argue about socialism, which has been tried, something that one could describe as socialism has been tried and found desperately wanting. We had a 60-year experiment in it. We've given it up. No one suggests we should go back to anything like that. Why are we arguing about capitalism and socialism? I mean, it's just some sort of California thing that's taken over the world, this absolutely pointless debate about two concepts that never made much sense as individual ideas, and have certainly been, to the extent that they ever did, they've been completely overcome. And to use the phrase that was popular some years ago, we all live in mixed economies, and that's as it should be, and that is, at least for the foreseeable, I mean, future, we're not getting away from that. There's no particular reason. They seem to work reasonably well. I find this debate very irritating. I've asked students when I've taught to write about capitalism and socialism, and they never occurs to them, never, that they should say, well, these are useless concepts. They have spirited defenses of capitalism or socialism, depending on which side of the aisle they are from. But the idea that they're pointless just doesn't seem to occur to them. But actually, the first thing you should notice is that they're pointless. This is a triumph of ideology over reality that we have this debate at all. So I hope that was firm enough. Do you know where I stand on this now?
Yes, I think, Edward, we do, and it's actually a fantastic place to end. because your last phrase of the triumph of ideology over reality is, I think, a very good phrase, and that mitigates against the common good and trying to direct our actions or the law or society, in my view, to the common good and human flourishing. So with that, thank you, Edward, for joining us today, and very much enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here. I only regret that we didn't have any questions from the audience, but we'll, that will work. Okay, very good. Thanks very much.
Thank you.